everyone. Morning. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. We're going to get started. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I believe there were really good cocktail functions last night. So thanks for arriving here on time to hear us talk about the future energy market with a focus in on balancing. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Alex Felekis. I'm a partner here at Bowmans in the project's energy and infrastructure team. Before I speak at these events every year, I give a running tally of how many private generations we've closed, and we're on 5,000 megawatts as a team. So very proud to actually say that. What we're going to focus in on today is something that this combined team has spent the last 2 years really trying to understand, because it's not very simple. So we're going to talk about the future wholesale electricity market, but with a focus on the key considerations that are most important to the energy participants in this space. We're going to start off with Robert Futter from Cresco, and he's going to talk you through what's going to change, put a little bit of, dread in you. And then Olga's going to talk you through balancing, or Olga and I. Olga's going to talk you through practically what balancing is, and I'm going to talk to you about contractual risk mitigation. We then are going to also look at how you can practically mitigate your risks. And that's where Taf and Michael are going to come in, and they're going to talk to you about generators' obligations in relation to forecasting, managing your risk when you're participating in the market. And Mike is then going to look at it from a customer consumer perspective in terms of demand forecasting. We'd like to ask that you actually keep all your questions until the end, and then we'll just see who's best placed to answer them. So with that, I'm going to let Rob come up and start us off.
Thanks, Alex. Cool. Working? Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. So I have used this slide before, so apologies. Good consultants reuse everything with an 80% turnover rate. But the journey we're on at the moment is obviously a very interesting one. We have wind, solar, and I understand yesterday probably the largest private sector PV and BESS project signed, which is amazing and well done to those involved. We've now moved on to aggregator PPAs, a combination of guaranteed energy or minimum energy and subscription energy. And lots of the aggregators that we review their PPAs all say their PPAs are unique, and in certain instances is, but in many cases, they honestly are just using different terms for similar concepts out there. We're now seeing more BESS enter the grid, and now we've got our eyes open for this future fully liberalized market. And I'll touch on some slides later, but for me, the fully liberalized market's probably only 2030, when there's actually real electrons to trade. We'll have some little bits and pilot trades and practice trades before that. But before that, we also believe that there will be probably more ancillary service type engagement because of where the system operates. So our clients are asking a number of questions for the year. As Cresco, we mostly work for loads, but we're doing a lot of work for the aggregators as well. And the two questions is load shedding over, or is it just a slight change? And is the real question in the room, have we just actually lost demand? And is that one of the key reasons we don't have load shedding, which I think at a macro level has even more serious considerations. And then everyone talks about balancing and the reporting and the accuracy and the risk mitigation. And what does it actually mean for the generator, the consumer, well, the aggregator, and then ultimately the offtake itself. So these are the sort of 4 topics that we're going to sort of touch on at a high level this week. Now, I think many of you are close to the detail in South Africa, do understand that South Africa has significant seasonal variation. As much as we think the sun shines all the time during the year, maybe not in Cape Town, but definitely up in the Highveld, daylight hours, as an example, are quite a key material impact on this. And you can see on the left, the summer one, where we have long daylight hours, and in June, the middle one there. And you can see how the different technologies are having to play to support the grid. Now, I think the system operator sitting 4 stories down in Germiston are doing a phenomenal job of keeping our grid growing. but we do understand they're having significant challenges around understanding tomorrow, the next day, and going forward. And I guess hence the reason the concept of balancing. And under the SAWEM code, above 10 megawatts generator is deemed to be a balanced responsible party. And I know we'll touch that a lot longer. But we also believe that the system operator will require loads of a similar size also to have to become balance responsible. We see that in other jurisdictions. And you can imagine that the system operator cannot balance a grid if they're only seeing half of the story. You might not require me as an individual, not that I live in Joburg anymore, as a Joburg, to give my individual forecast, but we do understand that statistically, residential and sort of light commercial has a very solid demand profile, whereas you can imagine a smelter or mine has a very inconsistent load profile from that point of view. And that's why we believe all of this is coming. It might not be sitting in the code, it might not be explicitly said, but I think when the stakeholders start talking together and realizing to run a grid efficiently, we need as much visibility on as much data as possible for people to make the most informed decisions. Now, we as Cresco do forecasting. We wrote an article with Standard Bank last year, and then lucky enough on the 1st of February, we happened to have load shedding, which is good for our report for credibility, but from a statistical point of view, it was complete luck. But we, over time, on the long term, do have real concerns around longer term load shedding. So at the moment, we definitely have excess energy. In fact, Eskom went out 2 weeks ago and offered large users an opportunity that if they increase their demand by 10%, you can buy that incremental energy at a 50% discount on the middle of the day and the middle of the evening. We believe this is a short opportunity. If the ferrochrome smelters get their NPA deals, which as a client of them or some of my clients, I hope some of them do, that sort of excess demand might go away quite quickly. But I think one of the real concerns we have going into the future is around the fact that when the coal either falls off or is forced to decommission for whatever reason you want, global things, cheap financing, carbon requirements, and we don't have the gas coming into the system quick enough. And I know there's a couple of players in the room here are looking at gas to power, and I think everyone's a bit wary of the program itself. But from 2030, we still see load shedding, albeit a different type of load shedding before, because I think previously we just didn't have enough electrons consistently through the day. Now we have too many in certain parts of the day on the right, and then we have a lot less in certain parts of the day, specifically in the early morning. I think we've always had an issue with early morning, and you can see the seasonality out there. And funny enough, the seasonality, there's more load shedding in February and March than there is in the middle of the year, because typically, we have stronger wind in the early morning, which is helpful, whereas we don't really have those benefits in the February-March stage. And the real question, I guess, is if we start hitting those high levels of 6,000 megs and that, can you actually run a market on high levels of load shedding? Because theoretically you can't, right? Because then it's every electron at every cost. And that is one of the other conundrums we have and concerns we have around the SAWEM idea is, yes, we'll eventually get to good market rules. We'll get to a situation in which maybe the vesting contracts aren't perfect, but it's a starting point. But if there's actually an energy deficit, does a market actually work correctly, especially sustained energy deficits in there? But this also creates an opportunity, specifically for the best projects where we can use the excess energy in the middle of the day and dispatch it in the middle of the evening. And I'll have a few slides on BESS going forward. But this is one of the concepts at the back that are really concerning around how does this work in practical reality. Now, this is a very complicated slide, and I'm going to try and take as much as I can on this one. And I'm conscious that you could probably look at this from 4 different dimensions, so apologies. But what I'm trying to show here is the linkage between the sort of the NERSA allowable revenue calculation, or the Eskom application to NERSA and allowable revenue, and then how we get to the market from a tariff point of view. So we had the previous one, bulk distribution, generation costs and distribution, all that. NERSA approved a higher fixed charge. I think it was Eskom's second attempt at trying to get a higher fixed charge in 15 years. I'm sure you're aware, Shirley Salvaldi, ex-Eskom, works with Cresco, so she's given us some really good insights on how that works. NERSA approved, in true style, 40% of what Eskom asked for simplistically on the changes, and now we have a higher fixed charge, we have an extra time of use change, and then we have a slight rebalancing of the time of use period. This is just step one on the journey of trying to get to fully further unbundled tariffs. Cresco believes there are another 4 scenarios involved, and that's what we've done for a number of our clients. Well, 3 scenarios. We probably have now a 4th scenario with this concept of super off-peak, which I'll untouch later. But we see over time, probably over the next 5 years, because this change probably will take 2 years every time there's an application. It's probably too late to make another change for this year, but definitely for the April 2027, we think there's going to be another Eskom retail tariff plan change, never mind the increased change. And then we're going to see even higher fixed charges. We believe there could be 4 time of use periods. And there's definitely going to be a move from monthly to hourly reconciliations. I know in the last wheeling rules, they talked about being able to grandfather the monthly reconciliation process. In my view, it's a nice, noble gesture, but it's impossible to do from an actual reconciliation and an allocation point of view. If you're a large user who bought energy initially on a monthly recon and the second deal they do is on an hourly recon, how could you ever figure out whose energy gets allocated first or second? There's no prioritization or subordination like you might be in a loan type allocation. So, but what ultimately means is there's going to be a lower energy charge with 4 time of use periods and probably even a further rebalancing in the time of use structures, perhaps with off-peak even becoming lower, because Eskom uses time of use as a demand, either incentive or penalty, as a real blunt stick, to be honest. That's where we get to the middle part of the discussion there. And then trying to take that concept further, we then really have 2 discussion points. We move towards the regulated market and the wholesale market that ultimately will end up in a SAWEM market. And the middle thing with the graph around it doesn't actually truly depict the story, but I'm trying to tell the story in a linear fashion. So you could unpick it and say, I'm not quite correct. But there's a lot more to it in a 7-minute presentation. We can see so many more charges considered out there. We see the ancillary service charge now becoming quite a material cost in the system. We know the old legacy charge, the capacity charge being higher. And we hope at this stage that we might truly get an unbundled tariff with costs not sitting in different places. We might all disagree with the fixed cost component of the Eskom proposal, but let's leave that for today. But you can see that hopefully we have a system in which all the costs are fairly split out. And if you're not incurring that cost, you shouldn't pay for that cost. The energy charge is really representative. It doesn't mean it's always going to get lower. But then there's the wholesale market that's only really looking at the energy charge. And the representation is there to show that from, call it energy being generation really high here. I know this doesn't have any private sector energy in it, but the actual energy component of the market is actually getting smaller, subject to obviously the more generation coming on from that point of view. And a lot of our clients battle, at least the loads, to understand, do I need to enter the market? Now, if you're a 20, 40 megawatt load, unless you believe you want to be a market participant, you probably don't have to. You can either stay in the regulated market and continue to buy your wire usage from Eskom distribution, your balance of energy from Eskom distribution, and then from your 3 or 4 wheeling deals that you may do over time. If you're a ferrochrome smelter or a large smelter or a large user, or perhaps you have energy that could be dispatchable, there's quite a few co-generators, right, in South Africa, then you probably want to be a market participant because that allows you to sell energy quickly. It's also a de-risking process. So different clients have different opportunities. The aggregators who will eventually, in my view, become the traders, right? And I don't think we will have 25 traders. I think there's 25 licenses at the moment. I'd be surprised if we actually have 25 traders truly operating in 2030. I think there's going to be consolidation and movement, and some licenses might be just there to allow them to buy and sell between a number of portfolios and a number of clients out there. Will actually become quite small to form the market there going forward. And then we have the market, which will be unpacked through 170 slides if you phone Cresco for advice going forward. Okay. I think most people have seen this slide too. This is Energy Council's view of the market, conscious that this might not be Energy Council's latest view, that it is changing all the time. But I understand that the minister, good minister, who apparently flies economy class. I was like super impressed to hear that the other day. He was sitting at the back of the plane with the rest of us lesser mortals flying down from Joburg, is that he is committed to, by the 1st of June, they will open the firewall and the outside parties can look in at the Eskom trading system and start, for us consultants, prove that our energy numbers are completely wrong. Hopefully not completely wrong, but more in the ballpark. And that for me is, even if it happens on the 1st of August, 1st of July, it doesn't matter. As long as it happens this year, it shows a step in the right direction. We then, in probably later 27, early 28, we'll see the pilot IPPs join, the large power users, and then the aggregators and traders. But to be honest, we don't see a huge volume of actual energy available to be sold at this stage. There might be a little bit, if you've got a guaranteed energy and you've got a P50 over the top, you might have a bit of that energy available. We know there's a few deals in the market at the moment where there's been termination from the load, so there might be a little bit of megawatts available there. And some of the new projects I know that are being built do have a bit of capacity for excess. But the amount of energy available to be sold into the market, even if the system works and even if the settlement process works, in our view, is really low. And that's probably a good thing, because we honestly just want to test the market, check that the settlement works, and more importantly, make sure that our forecasting and potentially our balance responsibility works, so that when everything comes together later in, we know our systems, controls, processes, and when there's a lot of energy, that we're up to date and we've mitigated the risk as much as possible. However, I think the capacity ancillary service market is going to happen much quicker. And you don't actually need SAWEM to be fully operational. The system operator can still buy energy on like the short-term program, and that you don't need a system marginal price. And that's really important. So, and apologies if there were people at yesterday's event and I'm telling the story again, but what is not known about a lot of the NPA deals, and there's lots of things about the government shouldn't subsidize ferrochrome smelters and other smelters out there, but part of the deal is that these smelters have to sign up to a lot of technical benefits to the grid, IDR and SDR, sometimes in excess of 300, never mind load reduction when we're under pressure. So the system operator is using, let's call it the ferrochrome industry, 2,000 megawatts of load as a huge battery, and probably the cheapest battery in town because there was no capex available. If that ferrochrome business does not continue, they've lost this technical benefit dispatchable generation, and that market needs to be filled really quickly. And I guess that's the real opportunity around BESS, and why we see that potentially the capacity ancillary market and eventually the reserve market, because you do need SAWEM to operate to get that, will kick off. And we believe there'll be more trades or more opportunity in that part in these early years than there will be in the actual pure SAWEM market going forward. Now, what does it mean to the PPAs? So at Cresco, in true style, we've taken a PPA and we've turned it into Excel. That's how we speak, right? And we try to start, because we're conscious that when you look at these things and working together with Alex at Bowmans, we're trying to give our clients a combined view of what the commercial issues are, the legal issues and that. And it's very hard to compare two PPAs, because when you read one clause, one looks better than the other, but then you read these clauses and this is better than that one and that. So what we've tried to do here is a combined assessment, and this is just an extract, an example. So we've looked at the risk categories and we looked at the control categories and we looked at the weightings. And this is specifically not make sense because I want you to phone me and say, I need some help with this stuff. But the idea here is to kind of be able to benchmark these PPAs against each other. And we have a whole scoring matrix. And we've created through some recent RFPs and some old PPAs, not quite the industry standard, because we're not there yet, but at least a market precedent or a benchmark that we can use. And then to go to clients and say, your PPA is more in favor of the off-taker in these areas. It's less in favor of the off-taker in these areas. And under the SAWEM preparedness, no one's even thinking about it. And therefore, we should start putting some wording in here. It's not going to be perfect, but at least let's put something in that when this happens, that we're not completely staring at a blank sheet. And the accountants and the lawyers are all excited because change in law creates some opportunity for all of us, right? from that point of view. Then the last slide, and this is very much linking to the ancillary services. Now, we all know best is opportunity. We talked about the good deal. So typical client, we have a 60 megawatt load. It gives excess energy in the middle of the day versus the load. This is a mining load, so it bounces all over the place. This is a combination of 9 sites. So you can imagine individually this is even more erratic situations. Build a BESS, 4-hour BESS, dispatch in the early evening and the early morning, no brainer. We lose most of the excess energy. We create opportunity. There's arbitrage, but we only get 57% BESS utilization. This is over the year, not at a point in time. And it's very much driven by the seasonality that I showed earlier. Oh, we've got more opportunity. Okay, well, let's then start selling ancillary services to the grid, right? Or demand response or whatever the opportunity. That allows us to get to 78% BESS utilization. So we've still got something in the drawer, and yes, you can only go so far down before you reach your maximum discharge levels on that. What else can we do? Let's look at additional revenue stacking opportunity. This is an on-site PV and BESS project. Can we not also help with voltage support for the load, as well as potentially some load reduction from the system operator? That gets us 98% BESS utilization. At the moment, the projects we're working on are really only looking at the top left block. We're talking about the bottom left block. And yes, we do have security of supply considerations for on-site. But at the moment, this is where we get to. And we believe by 2030 or 28, the bottom left block, if I'm standing correctly, your bottom right block, will become the standard for how people are looking at utilizing BESS, because you have more optionality in the grid. So we're going to hand over to Olga now, is that right? But hopefully I brought a couple of those topics together, because all of this then talks to balancing. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. So yeah, for those who don't know me, Olga Suchkova, I'm Associate Director at Cresco, focusing really on everything we do, but specific focus has been over the years on SAWEM, what it means for everyone, energy reform, where we're going, modeling of the grid, of the energy mix. So really trying to understand the nuances there. So yeah, that has primarily been the focus. And today, sorry, again, for those who have seen me before, I usually try to give you some insights. Today, I'm going to go really basic. So this is the first chat, proper chat, at least I'm having on balancing. So I thought, let us maybe go to square one, understand, the rules, and then we can maybe discuss, take it from there, really from the same base. So really the basics, fundamentals, apologies for a lot of text, just to help me, I guess, more than you. Balancing. So really what balancing is, what is important to understand is that we are adding significant amount of renewable energy. That means the intermittency of renewable energy is creating strong potential, it has the potential to create stress for the grid, and the legacy energy system that we have here was not really originally designed to handle this. So quite clearly, on from a technical perspective, there are many things that could go wrong, and that is just something that we need to consider. So from the balancing perspective, now what becomes important is grid frequency. It needs to remain at a constant 50 hertz, which relies on the exact equilibrium between the power supply and the power demand. Now that becomes critical. Even a small deviation usually targets the automatic countermeasures. So balancing is ultimately about the frequency, the grid frequency, and ensuring that our consumption equals generation, right? So balancing services are then used to manage the frequency fluctuations, and balanced responsible parties is really the first line of defense from those fluctuations, right? So in every market across the world, we've done a very large analysis together with the Energy Council, trying to benchmark around the world. And really balanced responsible parties is the first line of defense in all of the grids around the world, right? If the balance responsible parties and the market fail to maintain this balance, this is when the TSO then comes in and intervenes. So to keep the frequency then of the power grid constant, you have all those different parties, stakeholders who can provide, the necessary services. Those can be both the consumers and obviously the generators, depending on the service, the actual service that gets provided. From the most recent draft of the market code now introduced what is now called a balancing group. Again, this is a very typical approach. Portfolio type of balancing is beneficial. It's beneficial for the grid. It's beneficial for individual market participants. So again, a balancing group, which acts as a single portfolio and initially manages balance within the group, and then comes in terms of the balancing as a single unit, bigger unit into the grid. Again, is a very typical solution that all the grids utilize across the world. And then finally, to really discourage imbalancing, whether accidental or intentional, there is the balancing price. I'm sure everyone has been scared enough by this term. So the balancing price is basically that stick that tries to keep everyone in balance, or at least motivate everyone to stay in balance. And balancing price is usually significantly more expensive than the day-ahead price or the spot price. So I'm just showing a graph here. This is from Denmark 3 days ago. What is the date today? Can't remember, but okay, maybe a week ago. So 4th of February. And so the yellow line is the day-ahead price, and then the blue line is the imbalance price, right? Or what we're going to call the balancing price. And you can see the swings, right? So you can see that they have quite some swings in the morning, and surprisingly, they have quite a number of swings, very strong swings in the afternoon, so 2, 3 p.m. But I guess that just gives you the flavor, right? Even in a very well-established market like Nord Pool, which has been around for some 20 years, more than 20 years, these are the kind of swings that they are experiencing on a daily basis, right? So every time we go back to balancing and the risks around balancing, these are exactly the swings that we need to consider. So now if we go to the types of balancing services, it's just important to understand that balancing basically relates very closely to reserves, but not only reserves, right? So reserves is one resource that can be utilized. You also have other flexible generators who did not necessarily make it to establish the S&P, so they're there, providing ready to provide energy, and then these would be the resources that would be utilized by the system operator, and also the consumers. So consumers can also provide their own services. So from a reserves perspective, if we just focus a little bit on the reserves, obviously you can look at the reserves from two perspectives. You have the time intervals, right? So the time interval, how quickly the reserves can, become operational and provide the support. And I'm sure you've seen all of you have seen this graphic here. So instantaneous regulating reserve, 10-minute reserve, and then you also have you can differentiate between depending on the energy flow. So you can have positive or negative reserves. Then positive balancing energy feeds additional power into the grid and reduces consumption. And then the negative balancing reduces the amount of power in the grid or increases consumption, right? But ultimately the goal, as per the previous slide, is to return to the frequency of 50 hertz. Right, so from the reserve payout, we're going to see basically two payouts being available to those providing the reserve capacity. There's going to be the capacity payment being made to those generators, and primarily it will be based on the cost of lost opportunity. So the market code really goes far to define how exactly the cost of lost opportunity is going to be defined. The workshops, Keith and the team also went quite far to trying to explain how exactly that's going to work. And then, of course, should the reserves actually be asked to generate, that will just create an additional revenue opportunity from the generation perspective. So going into the balancing price, so this is really that next revenue. So capacity payments is one thing that's going to be fixed in nature. It's going to relate to the ancillary service charge. Now the balancing price is the payout. This is how the payout for all those, providing the balancing services, how that will be established, right? So draft 2 is providing, again, a very detailed methodology, how exactly the balancing price will be established. What is important to understand is that during the transition period, however long that's going to be, there is no defined period today. It can be 5. Initially, the discussion was that the transition period is going to last 5 years, but really it's up to NERSA to decide how long that's going to be. But initially, during the transition phase, during the transition period, balancing is going to be less punitive. It's going to be set at S&P plus minus 5%. Generally, this is not, your typical methodology that is being used to set the balancing price, and thus, that whole concept less punitive, right? So we are adjusting, we're transitioning. However, once the transition is over, we're going to get to the traditional methodology, which takes what is called the balancing stack, right? So all the generators get combined, the generators that were utilized to balance the system. You take and you basically establish the weighted average. There's certain rules. You eliminate the outliers. You eliminate, the generators whose costing sits above the market price cap, and then you utilize that whatever remains to set the weighted average price. And as we saw in the swings in the previous slide, it can be quite significant, right? That price can be quite significant. Okay, and really this is the last slide, just to give you maybe an example from Hungary in Europe. So this is back from 2024, so it's quite recent, right? What was established, what they discovered in Hungary, and I guess you didn't have to look far, I mean, it was quite obvious. They had a very serious mismatch in the setup of the market, of the balancing price, and the surrounding schemes that were there to support renewable energy, additions to the grid. What happened is that the government provided a scheme, providing a feed-in tariff to renewable energy generators. So those guys, they were getting the same income no matter what the market price was. So there was no direct link with what we are calling S&P. Because their revenue then was protected, these plants had no strong reason to react to the market price changes, right? In fact, very often they were better off not doing anything and just allowing the system operator to deal with the imbalance. They were actually receiving more money as a result of that. At the same time, the design of the imbalance market was, would set very strong and sometimes asymmetric penalties or rewards for being short or long in the market, right? So what that resulted in, really, those huge swings in their balancing price. So when there was sufficient energy, the prices would turn negative on numerous occasions. When the system was short, they were seeing really high swings. So the balancing price was really getting to those high levels. You can see the percentages here. So this is 800%. So you can understand the swings that were taking place in that balancing market. So really, I think this example just shows how important it is and I think we're stressing this, we can't stress this enough, right? The whole preparation phase that in which we're currently in is really there to ensure we do not end up in this situation. Last thing we want is to just set our market, our electricity market, in those swings, uncontrollable swings that just creates another layer of inconsistency, basically. At the end of the day, your every element of your energy system, of your energy sector, all the schemes, they need to talk to each other. They need to be balanced. They need to provide the right signals, and they shouldn't conflict with each other. There are numerous things that can go wrong. That's why we keep on saying that, your market simulations are crucial. The transition phase is crucial because that just allows you to understand where you're getting it wrong and make the necessary tweaks. But in any case, we look brightly into the future. Exactly. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. My name is Taf Mukwena. I work for a business called Orion Asset Management. And I guess the reason I'm here to present to you today is in our field of asset management, we're much closer to realizing the outcomes in the energy market. So we're looking at real assets and whether they perform against what they were planned to do. And in this instance, I think I want to try to bring into focus where imbalance actually occurs and why then it's important for you to prepare yourselves for the operational reality around that. So I think it's been covered extensively already. SAWEM is coming. When is a debate, but in essence, some of the decisions we make today have to be driven by the reality that we will end up in this destination. And I think ultimately, because it's a physical market, creates the potential risks that we're talking about in terms of imbalance. But along with that, then also comes an operational requirement for any assets, any participants, any balance responsible parties, which people have to start preparing for and arranging themselves to deal with. So the discussion so far has really been focused around imbalance and what it does and how the price comes through. But the reality of it is imbalance actually only exists in this part of my diagram. There is a point in time where you have to make a forecast about, from the generator's perspective, about what you believe you can deliver. And when we finally measure it at the meter and we discover what you've delivered, that is where imbalance occurs. And all of these mechanisms that we're discussing now are then to find a way of keeping that responsibility in the right place. And really the punitive measure then only becomes real for you as a generator somewhere around market settlement. In between those points is quite a lot that has to happen. And I'll take you through a few of those points. But the outcome is, as you're discussing where to place and allocate risk in PPA discussions, underlying that decision has to be am I prepared, or is the right person with the right operational capability available to actually manage the real risk, which is imbalance occurring between forecast and delivery. So this section really is talking about, as a full market participant, you will have to take a forecast and convert it into a submission. And depending on what kind of assets you have, whether it's a single or multiple, you have to deal with how to prepare that submission, what it accounts for. If you're a single asset, you have very little flexibility around aggregating and smoothing the potential around for deviation from your forecast. But this is purely driven by what do I believe I can actually put into the energy supply system on that day. And then dispatch happens and it will be automatic, and hopefully your asset has the full resource available to it. But where it doesn't, then you create imbalance. And that imbalance will be measured and calculated in the metering operation. Hopefully you are also keeping an eye out on that, because imbalance with the structure of the market is a continuous function. Every hour will be checked and you will have to show balance throughout that period. And then that metering number becomes a settlement. And you will get a settlement invoice from the market operator. And hopefully you can decipher it well enough that you can determine whether or not the imbalance charges that are applied to you do come from your physical dispatch. And that's a recon between what did I say I was going to do, what did I actually do, what did they think I did, and how did that come through as a price? And Olga's presentation really focuses on the fact that this physical event around the mismatch between what you forecasted and submitted as an offer and what was dispatched is then priced depending on the volatility in the market around that balancing price. Every day, depending on the situation beyond your control, you will have full exposure to that. And dealing with that exposure comes down to then becoming a liquid event. And I think this is where the pain that PPA discussions around where to deal with this comes in. Someone somewhere has to account for the fact that, one, you'll have to have a collateral position with the market that allows you to cover those imbalances. And that is a working capital issue. It's real cash held somewhere in the world that you have to be prepared to account for. Somebody has to be in a position today to make a decision around this PPA that we're entering into. How will it affect what I need to account for resource-wise from a cash perspective, and make that possible in the design of their business? So a real operational decision, but with a fundamental and real cost to it. And at the end of the day, I think one of the features that we've seen in other markets is, and again, you're talking about the piloting period, what we're really trying to get to is, will there be accuracy and certainty and dependability around what we end up with in that imbalance price and how it's allocated to you? Everyone will always have the question, because of the potential exposure, that am I certain that this is what I was really due to pay for imbalance? Was I the real cause? Was the cause somewhere else in the market? And you have to have certainty around that so that you can protect your position and manage your business properly. I think there was also mentioned from Rob's side that aggregators are really going to be a major feature of how our market will operate. The advantage they have is that they start to create some mechanisms around the ability to address imbalance. So the risk of imbalance is a real thing. It's a physical imbalance. It's a generator underperforming what its projection was for whatever reason, whether it's pure operational or resource, right? But because it becomes a financial penalty at the end of the day, there are mechanisms therefore that are available to mitigate the financial cost of your imbalance. You won't change your probability of imbalance by having more assets, because it's an asset by asset issue. But ideally, at an aggregator level or in a balancing group, you have the ability to mitigate the cost impact of that. And that again is an operational issue. It comes with complexity. Because now you're looking at multiple assets, you're looking at their probability of failure, you're looking at the volatility that happens in the market in general, and trying to find a way of mitigating that well. So decisions around where we allocate the imbalance responsibility for assets, should that be at the asset itself, should that be with the aggregator, those decisions again look at where is my operational capability to try and mitigate the financial impact of imbalance. Ultimately, the way I look at this, and being again from the operational side of how do you actually deal with this when you're involved in the assets, is it will require that we build systems and an ability to manage data that allows you to deal with the increasing complexity and the fact that the time frequency of events becomes much closer. Then there has to be a much better way of managing your ability to comply, but also to audit your compliance around how you're interacting with the market. Discipline around that, one, entitles you to be a market participant, but then also reduces your exposure to costs that aren't truly yours. And then this should result in an ability to manage, the real cash impact of what imbalances can do to a portfolio or to a single asset. From our side, really on the operation side of things, this becomes real discipline. Can you exercise certain disciplines fed by the data and your understanding of the market in order to manage this risk in real time? Somewhere along the discussion around PPA allocation of imbalance risk must then be this discussion around operationally, who is it who's in the right place to deal with this. So from my side, a fairly short run around this, but I think, the operations part of it becomes a big consideration in dealing with this. And where we are now, I think, as Rob pointed out, there are some elements of the market which may come into play, which requires you to already start thinking about placing yourself in a position where your operations can allow you the opportunity to participate in those elements of the market without creating risk for yourself. Hopefully that gives you a sneak peek into this. My next speaker, Michael, will speak about this more from the load side of it, but really I think the majority of the persons involved are always thinking about this from the generator's perspective, and it should have given you a small insight to what we're thinking already. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. I'm Michael Udall. I'm coming at this from a completely different angle. So I've spent the last 25, 30 years building technology platforms to help clients move through transformations, predominantly in the financial services industry as the rise of digital banking emerged, and how do you actually bring everything together to harness that transformation. So again, I'm here to talk about Florian. Florian's a software company that we are developing, and Florian's entire reason for existing is to orchestrate that complexity. And it's almost like the words were written somewhere in the divine, because all I've heard is complexity, 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 and risk would be another one to add to it. But what we want to do is really understand how we orchestrate this increasing complexity. So we've had a look at energy transformation and the value chain that exists within most of our clients, within the heavy users, and saying, well, currently you have technology that's been deployed in each of those verticals, and at the market at the moment is going quite deep vertically. What we're looking at, in order to really orchestrate the complexity, you need to harness the entire value chain and bring that all together to understand the relationship between the different parts of the value chain. And as they said, everyone's been talking about the demand forecasting from a generation side. And this morning, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing from a forecasting for our clients and how we develop that. So in developing a solution, I went back to my development team, and it's quite a concept to try and get someone who's developing fintech to try and get their head around this increasing complexity that's coming. I was like, well, think of the Springboks and Rassie Erasmus. If we were to have a game plan that worked in the 2024 season and use that exact game plan in 2025, the chances are we'd fail. But what we use is we use technology, we use analysis, we use data to iterate and learn and improve each time. And that's why, holding thumbs, we'll lift the trophy again. So that was really the inspiration that we took into the development of the platform. The platform we're developing has 3 layers. The first layer is that data lake, and that data lake is an aggregation of existing data. So working together with third parties who are specialists at delivering the data that they deliver, but bringing it all into one place, adding to that operational data as well. So the first value add is taking all of that data and putting it in a single place. It's not in PDFs, it's not sitting in people's emails, it's not in tab delimited files. It's all now sitting in one place, and the relationship between that data is connected. Second layer is the intelligence layer, and today I'll talk about what sits within that risk analysis. There's a lot more to come, because really we want to use the intelligence layer to give end-to-end visibility. We want to be able to deliver operational value to the energy manager on a daily basis, but also deliver strategic value to the C-suite on their expenditure and their transition journey. But it sits within that risk analysis where we look to add the value from a demand forecasting point of view. And again, the interface, we want it to deliver a personalized experience. The energy manager needs a whole different slew of data compared to a CFO or a CSO. So demand forecasting is part of this intelligence layer, and it is about being able to be more effective and efficient in that transition. So how do we see the forecast model working? It's really an iterative process. So we hope that the output of this will be budgets will improve over time as the demand forecasting will improve. Budgets, I might be simplifying to a degree, or look at the last 12 months divided by 12 and we put our forecast forward. The reality of that isn't the same. And I think if look at the mining sector, which is a big focus for us, within a mining group, there might be an open cast mine, there might be a shaft-driven mine. The data, the operational data that's coming out of those mines is completely different. And that data also fluctuates. So just that division by 12 isn't an accurate way to forecast. So it's how do we take that operational data, put it in the data lake, actually understand it. Is it ROM tons? Is it kiloliters? What is the actual element that's important for that business? And then we begin to build the intelligence. You'll notice there's a absence of artificial intelligence at this stage. That would be, we feel, a huge overclaim. There's an opportunity to begin to develop machine learning, but the data sets just don't currently exist to be able to actually deliver that value to the off-takers. So we've built a risk model that begins to link the operational metrics to the budgets. The output is in megawatt hours. We're using the 30-minute internal forecast, and we begin to link that to then set a realistic megawatt hour budget. And then we review that. So it's dynamic. This is happening on an iterative basis. So we review the actual versus the budget and actually understand where's the variance in the operational data. How do we take that delta, that variance, how do we put it back into the algorithm, and how do we use that to begin to almost coach this algorithm to understand what's really happening versus what was forecast to happen. And again, that allows us to go back to the budget and review that budget. What had we forecast? What's actually being delivered? And then begin to set a more realistic baseline, which hopefully changes operational metrics, but also changes the ability to negotiate with whoever you're buying that energy from in the future. And what do you want to do? You want to be able to monitor and optimize that. Again, this is an iterative process. It's a learning process. At the beginning, it's quite static with some machine learning, but this should become really dynamic and help you be more effective in understanding what your demand is going to be and how you forecast that demand. That was a brief whistle-stop tour of Florian and the impact it's going to deliver.
It's not.
Yeah.
There we are. It's still not, sorry, IT, still not moving. And that now is not me. Hello, Bowman's IT team. 5 minutes. Okay. On the PC, it's the right slide. How's at the back? Okay. Oh. Okay, so in the last few minutes, we've talked about practical and operational mitigants. Now, in the last few minutes, we're going to talk about contractual mitigation. Hopefully not the most boring part, just bear with me. Okay, so as a quick recap, who has balance responsibility? So in terms of the code and error, it's a licensed or... Okay, hopefully we can cut that out of the video. Okay, so it's a licensed or registered generator, a distributor, a trader, and a customer consumer if it is a market participant. Okay. You also have that the system operator will act as a BRP towards SAP interconnectors. And as you all know, the Central Purchase Agency will take on balancing on behalf of Section 34 IPPs. Now, very importantly, each metering point must be allocated to exactly 2 BRPs to account for import flows and export flows. And if you don't actually select a BRP or an entity that will undertake that role on your behalf, the default retailer is the BRP, and that is the distribution system operator. Okay. Now, what's really important is we've just set out who basically, through law, has the obligation to do it. But what's very important in the code is you can choose to designate someone else to perform that obligation on your behalf. Okay? So you make that election, and effectively that person then registers with the market operator as that designated entity. That party is then the entity that has to provide that information to the market operator. And what information are you providing? The trading units and the point of delivery standing data for that point of delivery. What's really important, though, is you still actually have to include identification of your counterparty for energy flows at each point of delivery. So what does that mean? In a private PPA transaction, if you as the generator are the balancing responsible party, you have to provide your customer or your consumer's data as well, which is why what Mike has just spoken about becomes very important. You register that data, and you can change it in a very dynamic way. So as long as you let the market operator know at 8 o'clock the day before you want to change it, that actually I'm changing who my balance responsible party is, you can change it. And then the last is on the default retailer. Now, what this slide shows you, it's a contractual diagram of basically the agreements and relationships under SAWEM. And the counterparties that are highlighted in orange, those are the entities that have balance responsibility in terms of law and the code, and that actually, in fact, could actually just be designated as a balance responsible party. So, for example, it makes sense for the trader in the middle to be that party for a balancing group. Now, something noteworthy is that customer there that potentially isn't a market participant and still buys from Eskom distribution and then maybe supplements some of its load through a private bilateral. That entity, in terms of the code and error, is not a balance responsible party. But because of what has to be reported in terms of balancing demand and supply, their forecast is obviously, that is still something that has to be regulated. Okay. So the teams all touched on a few of these, but how can you actually mitigate it practically before we get into contractual mitigants? Olga's talked you through trading units into balancing groups. Something else to be considered is there is the metering accuracy band. So only if you are more than 5% of what your schedule is do you actually then attract the penalty. There obviously is active participation in the intraday market because you can actually change your schedule dynamically before the next gate closure within that day. The CPA can also combine multiple IPPs into trading units to mitigate its position. And Rob touched on it in his slide. What's going to become more important is batteries. Okay. All right, so in a private PPA context, we know that SAWEM's coming. We know that there will be balancing obligations. Do you regulate it now in the PPAs that you're negotiating, or do you regulate it later? That is effectively the key question that our clients ask us at the moment. So if you choose to agree a regime around balancing now in accordance with market code version 2, what are you agreeing? You're agreeing which party is the BRP. You're agreeing if a fee is levied, how you basically recoup based on who's to blame. And what you would still need, though, is you would still need to make it very clear that if the parameters that you've agreed upon change in terms of the market code changing or the law changing, you can still rely on change in law. Okay? The second is that you don't actually regulate it in detail at this stage, but you make it very clear in your PPA that when that obligation actually becomes enforceable, it is a change in law. And then you agree what your relief will be, or basically how you agree what your relief will be around certain parameters. Now, key considerations come to mind in terms of risk allocation and how you actually back this out in terms of your contracts. And the first question is, can an imbalance fee or balancing payment now be passed on to a customer? Okay. Now, we've just discussed the fact that there are a lot of practical mitigants. So what would your customer actually say to you? A load will probably say to you, I shouldn't actually ever have to bear this risk. I'm not a balancing, I'm playing devil's advocate. I'm not a balanced responsible party under the code. You've got a lot of practical mitigants available to you, and this should never be my risk. Now, there's a place for it though, if that load falls part of a balancing group, and that load effectively has the ability to make that group out of balance. So identifying the risk mitigants, allocating them, and as Olga actually said to you, some risk mitigation is actually best managed by the customer, whether they can actually reduce their demand in a very efficient manner. The next question is, should the generator or trader be able to pass through to the customer additional costs for putting systems and technology in place to mitigate the risk? And when I first asked that question, you're going to say to me, of course they should. But here's the nuance. Your obligation to be balance responsible is what is imposed by law. Okay? That is the change in law. How you choose to mitigate that and the cost incurred to mitigate it is your choice. So this point is going to be a topic of negotiation. A third one that's not on the slide that came to me late at night, as these thoughts do, is force majeure. So if we are going to consider the principle that if you're in a balancing group, and even if you're not, because a balanced responsible party has to report both sides of the contractual, of the delivery and the wheeling mechanism as such, what becomes important is if for the reason I was wrong is an event that's outside of my control. So if that event was a force majeure event, okay? In the usual context in our PPAs, you have either party asking for relief for their obligations. When it comes to balancing, though, and a balancing penalty, you can only be afforded that relief if the market operator is giving that relief. So it's very important for us when we actually have that pro forma balancing agreement to actually interrogate that section in terms of how we back that out into our power purchase agreements. Okay, so just a quick summary of required PPA provisions. Who's the BRP? Okay, deciding, is that me, generator? Is that the aggregator in the middle? Are we doing it in a balancing group? If we're doing it in a balancing group, who's the managing agent for that group? And from a trader perspective, am I charging a fee? Risk allocation. So this goes back to what I said, that where there are practical risk mitigants available, you're allocating those to the parties to the contractual agreement. You're going to do this, I'm going to do this. If you fail to do this, I can come and ask you to recoup that imbalance penalty. Obviously, it's very important that you then mirror your obligations that are on you in the market code in your PPAs. So a lot of this, everybody knows, this isn't anything new, but your forecasting, your scheduling, and then obviously making sure that there is dispatch compliance. You have enough information from all counterparties to be able to give sufficient information to the market operator. Imbalance settlement. Do you agree something very linear in terms of how that balancing agent gets compensated? Or do you effectively actually just mirror the calc from the market code and say, this is how we'll work it out? And depending on who's to blame, you pay your proportionate share. Another very important consideration is that credit support that's in private PPAs at the moment is for payment risk for electricity, for the payment risk for the supply of electricity. Now, there's additional liability. So does that credit support change? Does it actually increase to actually cover potential liability under the balancing mechanism? You guys have heard me talk about this a lot. Change in law. So change in law, whether you agree it up front or you agree it later, your change in law regime has to be very robust so that you know the parameters in which you're entitled to relief. So that's all from me, guys. I hope that was food for thought. I'll do a little Rob sales pitch and say that if you have further questions, you can come and ask me and I'll send you a quote. So we're going to take questions now. I'm going to let Rob come up and just facilitate those. Leave it on that slide.
Cool. Thank you very much. So conscious that if people need to leave, please run run away. You will get a recording, and I saw some people taking pictures at the back. If you did register, you'll receive the recording and the slides afterwards. So thank you for your time. There is a roving mic to come through, but maybe I just wanted to make a comment before we continue. I understand Namibia has regulated balancing charges. I haven't analyzed them in detail, and I understand they're actually very punitive. And there's one or two traders that are currently exporting power into SAP or through the MSO, I think it is, they call themselves there. And they are very scared of being out of balance at the moment. And they are taking very small positions to try and mitigate that risk. But the financial impact is material based on the imbalances that they are experiencing there. So just something food for thought. Any questions or comments from the room? There's one over here in the front. Thank you. So wait. Please say your name, face, favorite rugby team.
Rob, James Walsh from PTX Partners. You mentioned that ancillary services, capacity charges, or capacity plus BRP or balancing services may come in before the market. How do you see it, those services being priced and how does Cresco kind of forecast that to work?
So, I mean, there's Eskom went out with a short-term procurement program a year ago. So I think from a regulatory point of view, and Alex can jump in here, there's the opportunity to do that. Obviously, you can't buy 1 year's worth of services, so maybe they made it shorter. In terms of what is ancillary services priced at, we've gone through the NYPD. We phoned a few friends, got some WhatsApp messages to try and support the numbers behind the NYPD ancillary services. And to be honest, it is probably not our strongest number that we have to support it. We have some numbers, but my left thumb might be more accurate than the analysis we're doing. But we are slowly starting to see the price points of that. We are currently collaborating with a company to build a Plexos model to then start modeling the SMP plus the risk of imbalance using a portfolio. We don't have the cool toy yet there. And then from that, we believe we could start running some scenarios on a balancing pool basis. So that's part of that analysis. At the moment, the data we have isn't amazing, but we're getting better at what we think is the answer, or at least some of the risk mitigation approaches. Yeah. So 145.
Rob, Grant Roll from Inversa Energy. Favorite rugby team is the Springboks, if that's a requirement. Rob, earlier you talked about, and I know it's a emerging theme kind of through Energy Council, etc., about this, in inverted commas, soft launch of the wholesale market from 1 June. Is anybody clear yet what pricing mechanisms will be used specifically from Eskom Generation during that soft launch period? There's talks of draft vesting contracts. And I wonder, as Cresco, between yourself and Olga, do you foresee any risk if those draft vesting contracts are heavily weighted in the favor of lots of recovery in a fixed manner and very little in a variable manner, and the confusion or anchoring that could create in the market around future wholesale electricity prices, etc. And yes, there's NERSA processes to come where that could be ironed out, but there's risks when, there's first impressions count, and there's risks potentially for the market. Do you foresee those, or are those outweighed by the potential positives of testing, etc., and some form of visibility? And I guess the second part of the question is, if you have a wholesale price in this soft launch, and that price, if sort of wrapped up, it doesn't reflect the wheeling credit at a WEPS level, because we haven't had the further tariff unbundling or rejigging. How do we explain that as well? And what do existing stakeholders and lenders think about their existing deals that they've done? If you kind of draw, because the CPA is not a profit-making mechanism, right? There's all of this is back-to-back kind of through to the distributors. So yeah, just some thoughts, and I'm just wondering, has everybody thought through all of this, and is it going to be okay?
I'm going to start with a song, And I'll let Olga ask of it. Yeah. So I think I'm going to ask 20. I'm only going to answer 20% of that question because it's quite an extensive one. So I don't think anyone at the moment has actually taken a look in Excel, as an example, as our communication tool of all the energy cost in South Africa, private, government, subsidies and that, and said, actually, where does all the energy costs go and where do the things? So I think we're missing that bit. I know Shirley and Energy Council and that are working on a wholesale tariff plan, but I don't think it's backed by very strong numbers at the moment. It's more conceptual and written documentation. So we're definitely missing that story, who takes this, who takes that. That cool tariff graph that I have, we don't have that with numbers, detailed numbers. We started, but we're missing a lot of the data around that. So that's the first bit. Now, Eskom retail, in our NYPD projections that we're doing, we can see why Eskom is justifying higher fixed costs, with Eskom distribution and transmission requiring more certainty on cash flows to roll out. So we support a lot of that analysis, and we align with that, and that then ends up in a portion of the capacity charge or the distribution charges and things like that. So that we align with. We're also conscious that Eskom always asks, as you're buying a used car, right? You ask for this and you expect the person there, and then eventually NERSA and Eskom end up with the Mini without the free hubs, but the cool dashboard cover. I think you've gone. No. So we do justify that. On the fixed charge side for generation, we completely disagree with 70% fixed costs at a principle level, right? Because it kills the S&P, and the only person who ever will trade energy will be Medupi's marginal cost, last power station standing. However, Olga's done a lot of work in the coal costing at the moment using the really phenomenal data that NYPD actually gives us. And there, because of their fixed price contracts, there is a huge element of fixed cost attached to that. So there is a bit of reality that they've entered into these fixed price contracts there. And this is where I'm going to pass the buck like a good inside center to Olga. Gonna come stand up here.
So to your point, yeah, and to Rob's point, really. So we've been doing quite a bit of analysis and really trying to forecast the S&P. We have some historicals on the S&P, on the actual trading that is happening internally within Eskom, and we have those price points. So it is actually quite disturbing, the level of pricing that is there today. And once that, and we are very conscious to see, or we would really like to see quite urgently what exactly they're planning in terms of vesting contracts, because if it is the same arrangement that is there today, and if we're going to end up with the same level of pricing that we see today happening within Eskom, then we're in trouble. And that needs to be flagged. It should have been flagged yesterday. So the sooner they make that public, the better. So from that perspective, we are all for the soft launch or whatever they want to call it, just because we need the data, we need transparency, and we need to start acting on that. At the same time, I mean, I understand your concern on the one hand. On the other hand, I don't even know what would be a good way to do it, honestly. It feels like any way is a bad way, and we will have to just navigate. So the fact that Eskom has been doing this type of trading internally for many, many years is a known fact, right? Everyone's aware of that. The fact that the rules would need to change is also understandable. Now, how exactly what that means from a market perspective, what exactly, how they're going to structure it, that is the fine balance that we will need to strike. So as I say, we need to start somewhere. Is it the best way? Surely not. What is a better way is a difficult question, but we definitely want to see those price points, and we want to see, to be able to start influencing those decisions. Yes. Yeah, so we've done, as Rob mentioned, we've done quite an extensive analysis on trying to. So the problem that we discovered when we were trying to do the analysis, our understanding of the methodology, we applied it, when trying to forecast the S&P with the data that we had, and we ended up with significantly higher S&P than what we're seeing historically. So then we went back and we we started doing a more detailed analysis on the primary cost driver, which is the coal price, trying to understand what exactly the coal pricing is today, what the dependencies are, and how we see that evolving into the future. And just recently, just a couple of days, a few days back, we received the results of this analysis, and now we're actually sitting in the ballpark. We're very happy about this. So we cracked that part of the whole analysis of the data. We understand, the dynamics that are there and the costing that Eskom is facing at the moment. But again, to my previous point, if we continue applying the current methodology as Eskom applies it, we are in big trouble from a renewable energy perspective. The price levels are not even close to being sufficient to remunerate those private guys. So vesting contracts are important. It is important to understand how they're going to reshuffle that to make it worthwhile for anyone to really participate and to create that, ultimately, the competition that we're all looking for, right? Because ultimately, it is the competition. It is the fair playing field, that fair play that we're all after, and that is so needed for the market. Hope that answered 50% of your question.
Well, thank you, Olga. No other questions? Oh.
It's Mark Waters from Sasol here. I'm just curious, maybe to both Bowmans team and Cresco, has there been any early work in parties approaching you to offer or develop imbalanced PPAs? This is now some entity looking to offer the service through contractual means to a BRP, who then has some means, whether it's financial or physical, to sort of back that imbalance and smooth it out for them in some physical or financial way.
So I'll talk, and then Alex, you can continue. So on our recent tender, I think we received 15 bids, and only one spoke about balancing responsibility. They didn't offer to offer the balancing, but they said it's for the risk of the off-taker, which clearly counted against them. So only 1 out of 15, and these were from what I would call the people that have real projects. So at the moment, we're not seeing it very explicitly done in the PPAs. I am aware that all the PPAs that we've been involved in, and we might also be at 5,000 because we do a lot together, but not always together, have my other half with web. Sorry, yeah, can't say that aloud, Alex. I want to make it out of the building. But I'm aware that pretty much all the PPAs we were involved in will have to be restructured in some way. To make sure they're ready for this, or the counterparty needs to take that risk on their behalf. And I think, as we discussed earlier, you're in a great position as Sasol to rather take maybe that obligation because of the balancing pool opportunity. There are some other large loads who could probably play a similar type role, or partner with other loads, the co-generators, right? So having a smelter and a co-generator and 4 renewable generators and maybe a gas one, as long as they're in the same transmission zone, is a real opportunity. No, nothing like that.
Is that we are considering those structures, but obviously they're confidential, but we have started thinking about that.
Rudolf van Heijsten from PwC. I wanted to know, you talked about ancillary services and the market when that comes online 2027 onwards. So at the moment, the bulk of it is ancillary services is coming from Eskom themselves. How easy do you think is it to crack that market up until that ancillary services market gets unlocked? And secondly, maybe a question for Alex is, I'm starting to think if that ancillary services asset is synchronized and available, but there is, for some reason, the transmission system locks that asset out due to a transmission failure. Alex, would that constitute perhaps a force majeure? Because it's not now a deemed capacity issue where it's energy not delivered. So how do you deal with ancillary services from that perspective? So sorry, 2 questions in one.
All good. So, I mean, at the moment, my understanding obviously is the Eskom fleet has limited real ancillary services support, right? So they can fluctuate some of the coal fleet. They have Avon and Dedisa, they have the smelters, and they have a few co-generators, Sappi, Ilovo, those things. So, but if you lose the smelters, you've lost probably their largest base, hence the reason the opportunity there. They would, in my view, desperately looking for more technology options, hence the base opportunity. I don't, in the short term, you don't need the S&P, right? They could just go to the market and say, you know, sell me services over here, and I'll contract you on maybe a 3-month deal. And then at the end of 3 months, you know, I'll top you up for what you capacity. I think that is possible. It is allowable under the PFMA and that sort of stuff. But it's very much going to be calling all pockets, find out what's there. Under the short-term procurement program that I know Keith ran was about 18 months ago, I think they were bitterly disappointed at actually how much energy was available to sell to Eskom. Most of it's found a private sector home already. So I think the system operator is going to go out there and they're going to find that you might get a couple of megawatts, a little bit of this, but reality, we're missing a huge chunk of what's needed to balance the grid.
Yeah, so in terms of if basically you're going to be providing those ancillary services under the framework of the market code, there is a force majeure regime. So if effectively you cannot do that due to a force majeure event, then there's recourse for that. Obviously, then there's the interplay of how that works under to the extent that you've also done that in terms of your private PPA. So you're providing ancillary services off the back of a private PPA arrangement, then there's obviously then just considering the whole interplay between those two agreements as well and your obligations under both.
If I can just also add a few words. So in terms of the services that are being provided, so ultimately we need to also distinguish between balancing and then congestion management. So what you're talking about is this conflict between balancing and congestion management. They're different, they're similar in a way that they're used to stabilize the grid, provide the ancillary services. But ultimately, very often, these two concepts, they come into conflict. It's no secret to anyone. It is a very common situation across the world. And I'm sure there will be provisions that will be made both from the system perspective and legally. Because as I say, all of these are usually contracted. Congestion management is a contractual type of arrangement. So most certainly it will be regulated.
Rob, Olga, has Cresco done any modeling on how much liquidity an aggregator or trader would need on both sides of the platform from a generation as well as a load perspective in order to be able to provide the same sort of balancing service or balancing mitigation that Eskom distribution would be able to provide those loads? Because obviously they have a pool of liquidity of demand at the moment. So if any of one of their load customers is slightly out, they can kind of just redistribute and mitigate balancing costs, which is not easy for the private sector currently. But where is that tipping point?
So we've done the work around how much liquidity is needed when SAWEM is in full swing, not necessarily the balancing component. So how much energy is available, the 3-month sort of market account, I think it's called, market allowance account, potentially the amount of guarantees that are required if you are doing a typical aggregated deal and you're selling into the market based on structures. So we've done that as some energy council work, but we haven't taken it to the next level to say, how much money do you need to cover Taf's market settlement for imbalances? I guess that would be the next bit of work.
Yes, and also remember, we keep on talking about phasing of the markets. You have the actual phase in terms of milestones, who is allowed to enter. But ultimately, there is also a problem of electrons. You will have two systems running in parallel. You have SAWEM, but the private deals are actually allowed to run in parallel. So your biggest system pool will accommodate SAWEM, but also be bigger than that. And the volumes, a lot of the biggest part of the volume really, especially initially, will not be participating in SAWEM because it's contract, it's private, they're corporate PPAs, etc. Right? So they're not forced to go through market. Maybe eventually we will get there, but initially So speaking of liquidity, that's just another way of looking at it. You know, how big that trading volume will really be, that will be, you know, accessible by the private guys. And how quickly that will ramp up. You know, how big that merchant allocation within each project will be, and how quickly, again, that will ramp up.
I mean, in the SAP power pool, as some of you know, quite low liquidity in that, but 80% of energy is still traded on a bilateral basis, not through the market. And they have yet to have their first balancing trade. They have the cool toy and everyone's waiting, but no one has the technology to inject it yet. Okay, I think we're getting on with our day. The rest of us have speed dating, but a last question? Oh. For the recording, we need to get your name and Alistair, please. Sorry. Otherwise, it seems weird when you're talking and you don't know what the reason. Yeah.
Sorry, it's Alistair Campbell from Vantage GreenX. Do you have a feel for the mix between trader PPAs and the actual amount traded through SAWEM when it comes into being? How much of it is going to be done through these bilateral trades and trading licensed traders, and how much of it will be through the actual SAWEM?
So we have our list of clients that have signed deals with PPA dates and generation profiles and that stuff. We obviously don't have the full market, but most of the energy we see is tied up at least until 2032 at volume. And only from 2032 onwards do we actually see potentially electrons coming online, 5-year PPAs rolling over, bit of termination and that. So we don't see a huge amount of volume coming in. And in fact, our analysis currently shows on S&P that renewables only starts really setting the price in 2034, 2035, I believe, is the current spreadsheet that came out. But I don't have a firm view on the question that you had.
No, we don't have the firm view at the moment, but we have all the necessary information to run that analysis. So that's actually the next one we're going to run. Yes, we definitely will have a view very shortly.
It is a question that everyone's asking, right?
Yeah.
So, cool. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Alex, for hosting us. Thanks for not falling off the podium. Have a good day.